The date is January 12th, 1995. A truck convoy moves through a snowstorm in the Canadian Rockies, headlights cutting through the dark like pale fingers across stone. Inside the crates strapped to those trucks, something that had been absent from one of the most famous pieces of wild land in North America for exactly 70 years is breathing, pacing, waiting. 14 gray wolves, not a vast army, not a tidal wave of apex predators descending on an unsuspecting landscape. 14 animals, cold and stressed from travel, about to be lowered into a place that had spent 7 decades learning to live as though nothing would ever hunt it again. The biologists running that operation had a clear, modest goal. They wanted to see if the wolves would survive. They wanted to know if a population could establish itself, hold territory, maybe spread a little. What they did not expect, what nobody on any planning committee, in any university department, in any government office had written into a proposal or dared say out loud, was what would happen to the land itself. Not just to the elk, not just to the trees along the riverbanks, to the rivers, to the actual shape and course of the rivers. I am Lawson Gray. Tonight we're going inside the most documented, most studied, most genuinely staggering ecological comeback in recorded natural history. How a nation spent 70 years turning its most celebrated wilderness into an overgrazed, eroding, species-depleted shadow of itself. How 31 wolves changed all of that. And why the answer to what they actually did defies every simple explanation people try to give it. Let's go back to before the wolves, before the emptiness. Because to understand what was lost, you have to understand what this land was before humans decided that predators were the enemy. For thousands of years, the wolves of what would become Yellowstone National Park were not a problem. They were a process. They moved through the valleys and the high meadows in a relationship with elk, bison, deer, and beaver that was older than any of the mountains around it. The elk were everywhere, yes, but they moved. They had to. Because something was always watching, always capable of turning a moment of stillness into a final mistake. That constant low-level pressure, not even the actual killing, just the possibility of it, shaped where the elk went, how long they stayed anywhere, and which plants grew tall because the jaws that would have stripped them were never given the time. Then, in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, a systematic campaign began to eliminate wolves from the American West. The reasoning was straightforward and confident and completely wrong. Wolves were killing livestock. Wolves were reducing game populations that hunters wanted for themselves. Wolves were, in the dominant view of the era, simply obstacles, large, furred inconveniences that a modern, managed landscape had no room for. Federal agents went to work. Poison, traps, bullets. By 1926, the last known wolf in Yellowstone was dead. The park that was supposed to protect the wild, had been deliberately emptied of the animal that had held the whole system together. What followed was not immediately obvious. At first, the elk probably seemed fine, healthy even, numerous, and that was exactly the problem, because with nothing to keep them moving, with nothing to make any particular meadow feel risky, the elk settled. They found the places they liked best, the soft soil near rivers, the young willow stands, the aspen groves just coming up from the ground. And they stayed. They grazed everything down to the roots. They came back the next season and grazed it down again. Over years, over decades, those riverbanks went bare. Those aspen groves stopped regenerating. Young trees that pushed up through the soil were eaten before they could reach knee height. The elk were not being malicious. They were simply doing what any large herbivore does when the one thing that makes it nervous disappears. They relaxed completely, and the land paid for it. By the time serious scientific attention turned to the state of Yellowstone's northern range in the decades before reintroduction, the numbers were grim. The elk herd had swelled. Close to 20,000 animals were moving through the northern range at peak counts. Aspen and willow, the woody plants that hold riverbanks together and filter water and provide the raw material for beaver dams, had essentially stopped recruiting new growth into the overstory. Young stems were being eaten before they could establish. The trees that remained were old. The forest was not renewing itself. It was dying by degrees, one browsed off sapling at a time, and every year the elk grazed the banks bare again. Rain moved that exposed soil directly into the rivers, and the rivers ran heavy with sediment and cut their channels wide and shallow and unstable. It was a slow collapse, the kind that's hard to see from one year to the next, but that over 70 years had fundamentally altered the character of one of the world's most watched and studied landscapes. And there was almost nothing living in it that could fix it. Almost. In 1994, after years of environmental review, legal challenge, political argument, and the kind of bureaucratic resistance that turns conservation into an endurance sport, the decision was made. Wolves would be brought back. The plan called for animals to be captured in Alberta, Canada, wolves from viable wild populations that were genetically healthy and large enough to hold their own, and transported south into Yellowstone. The first 14 arrived in January 1995 and were held in acclimation pens inside the park for several weeks before release. 17 more followed in 1996. 31 wolves total, spread across multiple family groups, dropped into 400 square miles of land that had not heard a howl in 7 decades. The opposition was fierce. Ranchers on the park's borders predicted livestock massacres. Some hunters argued the wolves would devastate elk populations that had taken decades to build. A few went further and said the whole project was a fantasy cooked up by people who'd never worked the land, that wolves and modern landscapes couldn't coexist, that this was ideology dressed up as science. What almost nobody on either side of that argument was thinking about, not the supporters, not the opponents, was the willow. Nobody was arguing about the willow. The first thing the wolves did, predictably, was survive, then breed. The 14 and the 17 became more, and the more became packs, and the packs began mapping the park the way wolves always have. Through scent, through howl, through the slow accumulation of territorial knowledge passed from adults to pups. By the late 1990s, the population was establishing itself with a speed and stability that exceeded the most optimistic projections. But the ecologists weren't watching the wolves. Not primarily, they were watching the elk. Here is the thing about predators and prey that took researchers a surprisingly long time to fully appreciate. The relationship is not just about death. It never was. Yes, wolves kill elk. That is true and measurable and important. What is harder to measure, but turned out to be far more significant for the land, is what wolves do to elk behavior. An elk that lives in a world without wolves has no reason to avoid any particular place. The best grazing spot is the best grazing spot, and it can stand there for as long as it likes. An elk that lives in a world with wolves has a completely different calculation to make. A riverbank with tall grass is good food, but it's also a place where your sight lines are poor and where a pack moving fast through the willows can close the distance before you can accelerate. A valley bottom surrounded by trees is lush, but it's also a potential trap. Suddenly, the most nutritious locations become the most dangerous ones, and the elk stop using them the way they used to. They move more. They stay less. They keep their heads up. The ecologists who were watching the northern range in the late 1990s gave this dynamic a name: the landscape of fear. It sounds dramatic, but it's simply accurate. Fear restructured how 20,000 large herbivores interacted with the land. And that restructuring, working quietly and continuously across hundreds of square miles, changed everything that came after. Within 6 years of reintroduction, researchers measuring tree growth in areas that wolves were actively using found something that stopped them mid-survey. Vegetation was coming back at rates that should have taken decades. In some places, tree growth had increased 5-fold in just 6 years. 5 times. In areas that had been bare and eroded and seemingly unrecoverable. It wasn't that the wolves had planted anything, or that the soil had suddenly changed chemistry, or that there had been unusual rainfall. It was that the elk had moved. They had moved away from the riverbanks, away from the valley bottoms, away from the places that felt exposed. And in that absence, something that had been waiting underground for decades finally had the chance to grow. Nothing demonstrated this more dramatically than the willows. A study that followed willow recovery from 2001 to 2020, 20 years of measurement in areas across the northern range, found that average willow crown volume had increased by something close to 1,500%. Not 15%, not 150%, 1,500. The number is so large it sounds like a misprint, but it has been verified across multiple independent assessments. The willows weren't simply growing back, they were exploding back, filling in riverbanks and valley floors and the margins of streams with dense, tall growth that within a few years was providing shade and root structure and canopy cover that those places hadn't had since before the First World War. The aspen groves began regenerating too. Cottonwoods returned to stream corridors. The park's woody plant communities, which had been aging and declining for decades with no new growth establishing itself, began a succession that researchers are still tracking today. But the story was about to change shape in a way that nobody, including the wolf reintroduction team, had anticipated, because something was watching the willow come back. Something that had been waiting far longer than the wolves, and whose return would reshape the land in ways that even the wolves could not. When gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, a count was made of beaver colonies in the park. The number was 1. A single beaver colony surviving in a landscape that had lost all the willow and streamside vegetation that beaver need to build dams, store food, and maintain the kind of slow, deep, productive waterways they depend on. 1 colony, for a park of nearly 3,500 square miles. That is not an ecosystem. That is a remnant. That is the biological equivalent of a last ember. By 2021, there were 9 beaver colonies inside the park. 9. The sequence of cause and effect is almost elegant in its simplicity. Wolves returned, elk moved, willows grew back along the river banks, and beaver, which need willow more than almost any other plant, followed the willows. They moved into stream corridors that had been stripped bare for decades, found the recovering vegetation, and began doing what beaver have done for millions of years. They built. A beaver dam is not just a dam. That is the part that is easy to miss. When a beaver dam goes into a stream, it backs water up behind it, and that backed up water raises the water table in the surrounding soil. Suddenly, ground that was dry begins holding moisture. Marsh plants colonize the edges. The slow, deep water behind the dam warms differently than a rushing stream, supporting different insects, different fish, different amphibians. The sediment that was washing downstream with every rain event settles out behind the dam instead of clouding the river below. The stream bank stabilizes. Willows and alders push deeper roots into the now perpetually wet soil and grow taller and denser. And all of that complexity, the deep water, the marsh edges, the insect hatches, the fish habitat, the tall trees, draws in everything else. Ospreys, eagles, moose moving in to browse the willows at the water's edge. Songbirds nesting in the streamside canopy that hadn't existed here 30 years ago. 9 beaver colonies don't just mean 9 dams. They mean 9 centers of ecological rebuilding, each one multiplying outward into the surrounding landscape in ways that no single species could have produced alone. And then the rivers moved. This is the part that, when it first entered the scientific literature, caused a level of genuine surprise that does not often surface in peer-reviewed papers. Researchers studying Yellowstone's waterways in the years after wolf reintroduction found that the rivers themselves, their physical courses, their channel shapes, the way they moved across the landscape, had begun to change. Streams that had been cutting wide, unstable channels through bare, eroded banks were narrowing, deepening, and in some cases shifting their course entirely. The mechanism was not mysterious once it was mapped out, but the scale of it was. When elk moved away from riverbanks, plant roots moved in. Willows, cottonwoods, and sedges are not simply pretty. Their root systems bind soil together with a grip that bare ground cannot replicate. They hold the bank against the lateral pressure of moving water. They slow erosion, and as erosion slowed, and as beaver dams upstream held sediment and moderated flow, Rivers that had been actively degrading their own channels began to stabilize. In some reaches, they began to meander back toward older, more complex patterns, shallowing here, deepening there, creating the varied riverbed structure that supports far more life than a simple, straight, fast-running channel. Wolves changed how elk behaved. Elk behavior changed where plants grew. Plant roots changed how rivers moved. The chain of consequence was real, measurable, and documented across decades of field data. Meanwhile, across every part of this picture, the effects were rippling outward into parts of the food web that had nothing to do with wolves directly. Before wolf reintroduction, the main driver of elk mortality in Yellowstone was winter. Hard winters with deep snowpack meant starvation, and starvation meant carrion, and carrion meant that every scavenger in the park, every raven, every coyote, every golden eagle, every grizzly bear emerging from hibernation in early spring, had a few weeks of abundance followed by a long stretch of almost nothing. The boom and bust of that cycle shaped the entire scavenger community. When wolves began killing elk consistently through all seasons, not just when winter was doing the culling for them, carrion became available across a far wider window of time. Lean carcasses in October when bears were trying to put on weight before denning. Kills in February that kept ravens and magpies and eagles fed through the hardest weeks. The distribution of energy through the scavenger community evened out, and the scavengers responded. Grizzly bear numbers increased. The bears were benefiting not only from a more reliable supply of wolf-killed elk through the year, but also, indirectly, from the recovering berry crops that the reduced elk browsing pressure was allowing to grow back on shrubs that had been kept suppressed for decades. Ravens, which in some parts of the park had tracked wolf packs closely enough that researchers came to treat them as reliable indicators of where the wolves were operating, thrived on the consistent food supply. Wolves also did something to coyotes. They killed them, outcompeted them, pushed them out of prime territories, and kept their numbers lower than they had been during the wolf-free decades. This sounds like a simple predator-prey swap, but the downstream consequences were significant. Coyotes, when unchecked, are highly effective predators of small mammals and ground-nesting birds. With coyote pressure reduced, fox populations stabilized. Rodent communities diversified. Raptors, hawks, falcons, small owls hunting the open meadows found better hunting. The recovery of streamside vegetation brought back insects, and insects brought back birds, warblers, flycatchers, species that required dense riparian canopy that simply had not existed in Yellowstone for decades. Surveys of songbird populations in recovering riparian corridors documented species returning to places where they had been absent long enough that some observers had stopped expecting to see them at all. The elk themselves are worth a closer look because the argument made against wolf reintroduction, that wolves would devastate a herd that hunters and managers had built up over decades, did technically come true. The elk population on Yellowstone's northern range dropped from something close to 17,000 animals at the time of reintroduction to roughly 4,000 today. That number, presented without context, sounds like ecological destruction. What it actually represents is one of the most significant improvements in herd health and landscape condition in the park's managed history. The elk that remain are faster, more alert, and better conditioned than the overstocked, underperforming herd of the wolf-free years. Natural selection, operating through wolf predation, removed the slowest, the weakest, the most compromised animals, year after year, and what was left was a population at a density the land could actually support. The rivers and the soil and the willow stands are telling you whether the elk population is right-sized far more honestly than any hunter's count ever could. And the rivers and the soil and the willow stands are, after 30 years, saying clearly, this is what recovery looks like. There's a number that keeps appearing in conversations about this story, one that has now been cited in classrooms and museums and environmental education programs across multiple countries. A short documentary film explaining the chain of consequences that wolves triggered in Yellowstone, the behavior shift, the vegetation, the rivers, reached 45 million views. 45 million people watched a 12-minute explanation of how wolves change rivers and came away understanding something that most adults in industrialized countries had never been taught, that the world is not a collection of separate things, it is a web of processes. And when you remove a process, even a process that seems like a problem, even a process that frightens people and costs ranchers sleep and complicated the management of a national park, you don't just lose that one thing, you lose everything it was holding in place. The 70-year lesson of Yellowstone without wolves was written not in the wolves' absence, but in what the land became without them. Here is the thing that still sits with me about this story, the thing that resists the clean, satisfying narrative of triumphant return. The wolves didn't know what they were doing. They had no plan for the willows. They were not trying to help the beaver, or stabilize the rivers, or provide carrion for grizzly bears in October. They were doing what wolves have always done: hunting, moving, marking territory, raising pups, competing, surviving. The process they triggered was not designed. It was released. The distinction matters enormously because it tells us something about what conservation is actually for. The people who reintroduced those wolves in 1995 were not engineering a new ecosystem. They were returning a mechanism to a machine that had been running without it for 70 years and had quietly been falling to pieces the whole time. They put the part back. The machine, if you want to call it that, did the rest. The aspens grew because aspens had been trying to grow for decades and had finally been given the room. The beavers moved in because beavers follow willows, and the willows were finally there. The rivers stabilized because roots stabilize rivers, and the roots were finally holding the banks. None of it required guidance or management or follow-up intervention in the way that a farming system or an engineered landscape would. It required only that the wolves be present and alive and doing what wolves do. That realization, that recovery is not something we build, it's something we allow, is the quietest and most radical idea in all of modern conservation. We are very good at managing things. We are very good at counting elk and mapping territories and publishing reports and attending conferences. We are considerably less comfortable doing the harder thing, which is recognizing the limits of our management, acknowledging the damage our confidence has done, and choosing to step back far enough to let a process we don't fully understand do something we couldn't have engineered if we'd tried for a century. 31 wolves from Canada, released into a park that had spent 70 years being watched and studied and managed within an inch of its life. And the most important thing the biologists did for the recovery of Yellowstone's ecosystem was bring those animals to the gate, open it, and walk away. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we close. When the wolves arrived in 1995, there was one beaver colony in Yellowstone National Park. One. And somewhere in whatever remnant of streamside habitat was still viable, that colony had been holding on for a very long time, building and maintaining and surviving in a landscape that had lost almost everything those animals need. We don't know how long it had been alone. We don't know how many generations of beaver had lived and died in that single stretch of water, waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the conditions that would finally allow them to expand. There is something in that image, one colony, in a park the size of a small country, keeping a process barely alive through decades of decline, that captures what this whole story is about. The capacity for recovery does not disappear when the conditions for it disappear. It waits. It persists in the margins and the remnants and the single surviving pockets. And when the conditions return, when the one missing piece is put back, it does not creep back cautiously. It comes back with 1,500% more willow than anyone expected. It comes back with 9 beaver colonies where there was one. It comes back with rivers moving in directions they hadn't moved in living memory, and songbirds in trees that weren't there a decade ago, and grizzly bears fed through October on wolf-killed elk, and a northern range that is imperfect and complicated and still being studied, and still surprising the people who watch it most closely, genuinely, measurably, beautifully alive again. I'm Dr. Edwin, and this is why I keep coming back to these stories. Not because they always end well, many of them don't. Not because they're simple, none of them are. but because occasionally, when the science and the political will and the sheer stubbornness of wild things align in the right way, something happens that no spreadsheet predicted and no model fully captured. 31 wolves walked into a valley. The valley answered, "If you've stayed with this story all the way to here, I want to ask you one question before you go, and I'd genuinely like to read your answer in the comments." Yellowstone's wolves were returned over the objections of ranchers, hunters, and land managers who were certain it was a mistake. 30 years later, the data is unambiguous. So here is the question. What other places right now have a missing process? A predator, an engineer, a keystone species that was removed, and are quietly falling apart because of it? Where should the next gate open? Tell me below. Share this with anyone who has ever wondered why wilderness matters. And if these comeback stories are the kind of thing that keeps you watching, there are more of them, far more than most people realize, and we are just getting started. I am Lawson Gray. Thank you for watching.